You're listening to the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. On today's episode of the podcast, we review the final of the ICC T20 World Cup for 2021 between New Zealand and Australia from the Dubai International Cricket Stadium. It's the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast, and let's get started. Let's have a look at the match summary from the ICC T20 World Cup final between New Zealand and Australia from the Dubai International Cricket Stadium. New Zealand batted first and made 4 for 172 from their 20 overs. Williamson top scored with 85, and Hazlewood took 3 wickets for Australia. Australia, in reply, finished on 2 for 173 from 18.5 overs. Marsh top scored with 77 not out, and Bolt took 2 wickets for New Zealand. Australia won by 8 wickets, and Mitchell Marsh was named man of the match. What were the key moments and key factors from the final between New Zealand and Australia? Australia's bowling in keeping New Zealand to 1 for 32 in the power play and 1 for 57 after 10 overs, which was the key for Australia to keep New Zealand to 172, otherwise it could have been a 180 to 190 score. New Zealand's batting, Kane Williamson's innings of 85 helped New Zealand reach their total of 172. Australia's batting, David Warner and Mitchell Marsh's partnership of 92 for the second wicket, and the partnership between Marsh and Glenn Maxwell of 66 unbeaten for the third wicket were the key partnerships for Australia in winning this ICC T20 World Cup final by 8 wickets. Those were the key moments and key factors from the final between New Zealand and Australia. Let's have a look at both teams' performances with both bat and ball in this final. We'll start with New Zealand and their batsmen. Guptill 28, Mitchell 11, Williamson 85, Phillips 18, Neesham 13 not out, and Seifert 8 not out. That's how the New Zealand batters went about things in this final against Australia. New Zealand's batting in this final was a good batting effort. New Zealand didn't quite get off to a flyer with the bat. They were 1 for 32 after the power play, and they were 1 for 57 after 10 overs. Looked like New Zealand weren't getting a big total at this stage of the match, and Australia were bowling well and did well to keep the runs down and tighten the screws and the pressure on New Zealand. But it wasn't until after the 10th over that things started to go New Zealand's way, all thanks to Kane Williamson's superb innings. Kane Williamson's innings, he was the key for New Zealand to post that 172 score. He was the aggressor. His innings of 85 was some of the best batting I've seen in T20 cricket. He was fully focused and he was in the zone. He played his role well for New Zealand, being that anchor type role, and he steadied the ship for New Zealand, as he always does, Kane Williamson. He needed to bat for most of the innings, which he did. All the New Zealand batters struggled to get any momentum in this innings, and Williamson was the only one who was able to score freely and put the pressure back on Australia, whereas the other batsmen from New Zealand weren't able to do that. He played some unbelievable shots and cashed in on some poor bowling to him from the Australian bowlers. His partnership with Glenn Phillips of 68 for the third wicket was the key for New Zealand reaching that 172 score. Just a word on Kane Williamson. What a player this guy is. He's one of my favourite players to watch. And he's not really a powerful batsman. He doesn't have all the big shots that you associate with many of the big hitters in the game. But what he does well is his finesse and timing and his manipulation of the field. He picks gaps in the field where no other batsman can't pick that gap, but Kane Williamson does. And his innings was aggressive. He put the pressure back on to the Australian bowlers, whereas his other batsmen couldn't do that. He was the real aggressor for New Zealand, and he took it upon himself to play this type of innings and stand up in a final where it was needed the most. And that's very important, where you need players to stand up in big finals and big matches. And the captain, Kane Williamson, did that for New Zealand. And he played a truly captain's knock. It was some of the best striking I've seen. And he gave New Zealand a chance. Obviously, 172 in the end wasn't enough, but he tried his best to get New Zealand to a competitive total. It was competitive, It wasn't quite enough in the end, obviously, because Australia chased down the runs, but his innings was very important for New Zealand in this match. And they were struggling early on, New Zealand, because they couldn't really put the foot down against Australia. So after the 10 over mark, they really had to really kick on and push on. And Kane Williamson took that upon himself and said, right, I'm going to be the aggressor here. Anything loose from the Australian bowlers, I'm going to cash in. If you remember, he was dropped on, I don't know what score he was on when he got dropped by Josh Hazlewood, but he was dropped off Josh Hazlewood, and he made that second chance count. And whenever you get dropped as a batsman, you've got to make that second chance that you've been given count. And he certainly did that with his 85. And it was a brilliant innings from Kane Williamson. Looking back, maybe New Zealand could have put the foot down a lot earlier in their innings. If they were looking back on this match, they'd probably think, maybe we should have really got on with it at the start, especially in the power play. They were 1 for 32. They didn't really put the foot down. They were 1 for 57 after 10 overs, and they didn't really quite accelerate early on in the innings. So I think if they put the foot down a lot earlier, they would have gotten that 180 to 190 score, which would have been enough for New Zealand to defend on this wicket and would have put New Zealand in a good position in this final. Unfortunately, they got 172, and that wasn't enough in the end, obviously, because Australia chased it down with ease, winning by 8 wickets. So I think if New Zealand put their foot down a lot earlier, they would have been in a good position. They would have got that 180 to 190 score. Overall, it was a good effort with the bat from New Zealand to post 172 in the final. Kane Williamson played a magnificent innings for his team, but unfortunately it wasn't enough for New Zealand as Australia were able to chase down the runs. Let's talk about New Zealand's bowlers and their performance in this final. Boult took 2 wickets, no wickets for Neesham, Satner, Milne, Southey and Sodhi. That's how the New Zealand bowlers performed in this final against Australia. New Zealand's bowling in this final was poor, actually. New Zealand couldn't take early wickets to put Australia under pressure in the run chase. Australia's aggressive intent and positive intent with the bat put New Zealand under pressure with the ball, which saw New Zealand misexecute with the ball, with their skills and plans. Their lines and lengths were inconsistent. They just couldn't keep the pressure on Australia, and they couldn't take those wickets at regular intervals to put Australia under pressure. So overall, it was a poor performance with the ball from New Zealand. Overall, it was a good effort from New Zealand. They gave it their all in this final, but it wasn't their day, as Australia was simply too good in the end. Let's have a look at Australia's team performance with both bat and ball in this final against New Zealand. We'll start with their batsmen. Warner, 53, Finch, 5, Marsh, 77, not out, and Maxwell, 28, not out. That's how the Australian batsmen performed in this final against New Zealand. Australia's batting in this final was dominant. It was Australia's best batting display in T20 cricket for some time. They absolutely bossed the second innings of this match. Australia lost Aaron Finch early for 5 and wasn't the start that Australia wanted. They couldn't afford to lose any more wickets in the innings, otherwise they would have been under pressure, just like in the semi-final against Pakistan. David Warner's and Mitchell Marsh's partnership of 92 for the second wicket was the key partnership for Australia and held the innings together for Australia and contributed to Australia winning this T20 World Cup final. Also, the partnership between Marsh and Glenn Maxwell of 66 unbeaten for the third wicket was also the key for Australia winning this T20 World Cup final. Australia's intent with the bat was the key in this final. Australia's intent with the bat was excellent in this final. Australia play their best cricket when they're looking to be aggressive and playing with that positive intent and putting pressure back onto the bowlers. Australia in this final with the bat did that. They were able to put the pressure back onto the New Zealand bowlers, which created scoring opportunities for Australia because New Zealand were under pressure with the ball and had to change their plans with the ball and didn't quite execute with the ball under pressure because Australia were playing with that positive and aggressive intent, which caused that pressure on the New Zealand bowlers. So overall, their intent with the bat in this final was magnificent. Now, Mitchell Marsh stole the show with his match-winning innings, but we have to acknowledge David Warner's innings. His innings was very important because Australia lost Finch early, and Australia needed Warner to stay in. And that was the important thing for Australia, that David Warner's innings was the key in contributing to this win and success for Australia. Now, Mitchell Marsh, obviously, his 77 not out was the match-winning knock, but As I said before, we have to acknowledge David Warner's contribution to this run chase. As I said, they lost Finch early, and Australia couldn't afford to lose any more wickets, otherwise they would have been under pressure. His innings, David Warner of 53, was very important, and his partnership with Mitchell Marsh was very important as well. He did well to support Mitchell Marsh, and the pair of them were able to score runs and put Australia into a very strong position in the run chase, which then eventually contributed to Australia winning this match. So David Warner's innings was very important in this final. Let's talk about Mitchell Marsh's innings. It was some of the best ball striking of a cricket ball I have ever seen. His power is unreal, and that showed in his innings in the final today. He was able to perform under pressure. He showed great positive intent and aggressive intent with the bat. First of all, Mitchell Marsh, about his power. Unbelievable. It looks like he's not even breaking a sweat when he hits a cricket ball. You know, when he hits those big sixes, you think he doesn't put a lot of energy or effort into the ball, but he does. You can really see that. You can really hear it over the stump mics, especially when he's making contact with the ball. You can hear him grunt, and that's an indication that he's putting a lot of energy into the ball when he hits it, and he's really putting a lot of effort and energy into the ball. And that's why he's such a good power hitter, because he's such a strong upper body type player, Mitchell Marsh. He's got very strong arms, very strong chest, and he's able to hit those long balls for six, and it doesn't look like he's breaking a sweat when he hits it. And he's got a real talent there with his ball striking, and that's probably the advantage he has over some players, is that strength, his upper body strength, and the effort and energy he puts into the ball. It was unbelievable ball striking, and it was some of the best I've seen in cricket for some time. It was unbelievable. The other thing was that he was able to perform under pressure, and the partnership he had with David Warner was obviously getting Australia along to the victory, of course, which did contribute to Australia winning the match in the end. But when David Warner got out, it was up to Mitchell Marsh to stay in and finish off the job, which he did. And he performed his role superbly. And at that stage, anything could happen. You know, if Marsh went after Warner, then anything could happen in T20 cricket, as we all know, because cricket's such an unpredictable game. You know, you would have had Glenn Maxwell coming in early, along with Smith and Stoinis and Wade, and New Zealand, if they did take a few more wickets, they were able to put Australia under pressure at that stage, if that happened. Unfortunately, that didn't happen because Mitchell Marsh stayed in. He performed under that pressure, and he took it upon himself to say, nah, okay, David's got out. Okay, it was a good partnership. But it's up to me now to finish off the game under this sort of pressure in a final, in a run chase, and he played it superbly. The last thing about Mitchell Marsh's innings that I really liked from him was his intent with the bat. We talk about playing positively and having positive intent and being aggressive as a batsman, because that's very important. And he showed great positive intent and great aggression with the bat as well. I think it was his first ball that he faced off Adam Milne, and he hit it for six. That's the positive intent, and that's the aggressive approach that Mitchell Marsh showed from that first ball. That one shot got him going in this run chase, and he never looked back, and he played a superb innings because he showed that intent and aggressive approach with the bat. And he never looked back, and he played one of the best innings you'll ever see in a T20 World Cup final. The other thing I liked about Australia's innings in this final was that they didn't lose early wickets. Now, the problem with Australia over the last few years in T20 cricket is that they've lost wickets early. They couldn't afford to lose wickets early in the run chase. Otherwise, they would have been under pressure, just like in the semi-final against Pakistan. They didn't lose any wickets early in this final. They lost Aaron Finch early, but they were able to build partnerships and didn't lose wickets in clumps and have a batting collapse. And they were able to hold it together and not lose any more wickets early and win the game. And that's what I liked about Australia in the final. They really stood up with the bat. They knew what they wanted to do, and they executed their roles superbly. All the batsmen did, barring Aaron Finch, of course. He got out for 5. But Warner, Mitchell Marsh, and Maxwell really executed their roles with the bat, and they all contributed to Australia's success in this run chase. Overall, it was a dominant display with the bat from Australia. Brilliant innings from David Warner and Mitchell Marsh, and those innings were the key to Australia winning this T20 World Cup final. Let's talk about Australia's performance with the ball quickly and see how they performed in this final with the ball. 3 wickets for Hazlewood, a wicket for Zampa. No wickets for Marsh or Maxwell, Cummins and Stark. That's how Australia's bowlers performed in this final with the ball. Australia's bowling in this final was an okay performance. Australia's bowling was good up front in the New Zealand innings. They were able to tighten the screws on New Zealand early in the innings. They kept New Zealand to 1 for 32 after the power play and 1 for 57 after 10 overs. That pressure contributed to Australia keeping New Zealand to a 172 score. Otherwise, it could have been 180 or 190. They bowled well. They bowled good lines at lengths and were able to keep the pressure on the New Zealand batsmen. Australia's bowling in the second half of the New Zealand innings was a bit poor. Australia didn't quite execute their lines and lengths. They were a bit inconsistent with their lines and lengths, didn't quite execute their plans and skills with the ball. New Zealand were able to score runs and cash in on that poor bowling. So that's where it went a little bit wrong for Australia with the ball, but they did very well to keep it to a 172 score. In the end, it wasn't enough from New Zealand, and the Australian batsmen were able to chase it down. The individual performances with the ball in this final from Australia, Josh Hazlewood, 3 for 16 in the final. Unbelievable. He bowled very well, good lines and lengths, reliable Josh Hazlewood. He's really improved as a T20 bowler. He was the star bowler for Australia in this bowling performance in this final. Adam Zampa, he bowled very well again, 1 for 26 from his 4 overs. He's done it throughout this T20 World Cup, Adam Zampa. He's been very good for Australia throughout this T20 World Cup, and he showed it again in the final. Mitchell Stark didn't have his best day with the ball. None for 60 off his 4 overs. That happens in T20 cricket. You have good and bad days as a bowler. Unfortunately for Mitchell Stark, it wasn't his day today. Pat Cummins didn't take a wicket, but he performed well, and he performed his role for the team. Glenn Maxwell and Mitchell Marsh went for some runs, but overall, it was a good bowling effort from Australia. All the bowlers did their best and did a good job in keeping New Zealand to 172, and Australia were able to chase down those runs and win the final. Overall, it was a dominant victory in the end for Australia, winning by 8 wickets to claim their first ever T20 World Cup title. Overall, what a game of cricket we have seen between New Zealand and Australia, and what a T20 World Cup we have had. New Zealand deserved to be in this T20 World Cup final. Unfortunately, it wasn't to be in this final. They came across a very good Australian side. But they should be proud of their efforts as a team in this T20 World Cup, and hopefully for New Zealand, they can come back bigger and stronger in the 2022 T20 World Cup in Australia. For Australia, everyone had doubted them to win this T20 World Cup, but they have proved everyone wrong and were able to overcome the odds and win their first ever T20 World Cup title. Hopefully this T20 World Cup win can be the start of something for Australia in T20 cricket. Hopefully for Australia, they can win back-to-back T20 World Cup titles in 2022 in Australia. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get the latest episodes of the podcast, and like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Until next time, keep safe and bye for now.